Our speaker and guest today is Elaine Weiss, and she's a Baltimore-based journalist and author, and her writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and she's written reports for the National Public Radio. She's also earned a Pushcart Prize Editor's Choice Award and is a proud McDowell Colony Fellow. And the book that we'll be talking about today, her most recent, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, has won a critical acclaim from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, and the New Yorker, and is hailed as a riveting, nail-biting political thriller with powerful parallels to today's political environment. It was also a Goodreads Reader's Choice Award and shortlisted for the 2019 Chautauqua Prize and received the American Bar Association's highest honor, the 2019 Silver Gavel Award. And right now, Steven Spielberg Amblin Production is adapting the book for TV with Hillary Rodham Clinton serving as executive producer. And here's the cover of the book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Elaine Weiss, welcome to Book Breaks. It's great to have you on the program.
Thank you so much, William. I'm just delighted to be with you.
Right, so I just finished reading the book this morning, and I have to say riveting is the absolute correct word. It was really on the edge of my seat, especially those last few chapters, which I want to talk about it in a little bit. But I always love to kick off our conversations here on Book Breaks. What drew you to the topic? Why did you want to write the book? And specifically, why you were focused on the last state of Tennessee to ratify the 19th Amendment, why you were focused on that specific period right there.
Okay, well, I love answering that question because, especially for teachers, I think you'll appreciate that. And first of all, I just want to send out my salute to all the teachers out there in every season, but especially this one. You are keeping our communities together. So I wrote this book out of a combination of ignorance and curiosity, which I think is a real driver in education too. I realized that as an American woman, as someone who is really politically active and engaged, a voter. I vote in every election. I've taught my children it's important to vote in every election. And yet I realized I did not know how I, as an American woman, had obtained the right to vote. I knew that it was not in the Constitution when the Founding Fathers, in their wisdom, left many segments of American citizens out. And then at some point, it was. And I really, truly, even though I had studied American history, I've pretty well read, I had no idea. And I asked my friends, do you know how American women obtained a vote? And they looked at me very vaguely and sort of would murmur, oh, Seneca Falls. You know, they had this one notion in their head. And I realized we really don't know. And that's not to say there hasn't been excellent scholarship in this for a century or more, but it has not been written for the public, for the not just the casual student, but for someone who wants to read about our democracy and our nation in a popular narrative way. And so I realized there was this gaping hole. I couldn't find anything that told the story. That was something you kind of pick up and read. And I was curious about it. So I began to do some research, and I was looking through documents in the Library of Congress. And I was, shall we say, following the money. I'm trained as a journalist, so I was following the money, and I was trying to read about a bequest that was made to the suffrage movement in 1914 by a very wealthy, wonderfully flamboyant publisher in New York. And she had left $2 million, which was like more than 50 million today. And I was reading a report in the Library of Congress of how this was spent. And in it, it said, well, part of it went to start the League of Women Voters, and some of it was for lobbying in Congress for the federal amendment, the 19th Amendment. And some of it was for the ratification campaign. I realized, wow, I don't even think about the ratification campaign. You know, you have a constitutional amendment, there is a very set process, and the major final phase is to get ratification by 3/4 of the states. And it told the story of what happened at the last state. And the story was just so dramatic and almost crazy. And I remember, you know, coming down to dinner with my husband, and I said, wow, I just read this amazing account of what happened at the last step of the 19th Amendment. And he said, wow, that's a great story, but is it just an anecdote? And I had to go back and do more research and realize, no, this is not an anecdote. This is the epitome of what happened. All the arguments are there. All the characters are there, even though we're in the third generation of suffragists by 1920, when my book takes place. And all the themes were there of race, gender, corporate politics, voting rights and democracy. And I realized it was a very, very substantive tale, which I could tell by focusing on those last 6 weeks in Nashville, Tennessee, where this all occurs, but then being able to bring the lens back, give a wider angle view. And because of the people who are in Nashville, I could reach back. I could reach back from Carrie Chapman Catt, who is one of the main characters in Nashville, and reach to Susan B. Anthony, her mentor. And so I could tell the whole story in sort of flashback of how the suffrage movement came to have its final battle in Nashville, Tennessee, of all places, in 1920, by focusing on that story and then moving back and forth.
And as I said, it is an absolutely riveting read, and there's so much going on at this time. Can you tell, kind of put it in a little historical context, whereas it's World War I, the Spanish flu has been done, the Bolshevik Revolution. Kind of talk about some of those other influences that are impacting the era at that time.
Yeah, that's a wonderful lead-in to describe how the parallels to today, which I have to tell you, I did not expect them to be there. And I did not expect, certainly when I finished the manuscript in 2016, I did not expect us to be in the position we're in today, where there are more parallels and stronger parallels than I could have envisioned. But to go back to what's happening, why this would, first of all, why would this take place in 1920? The federal amendment, which was introduced in 1878, had been kicking around Congress for 40 years. And why it emerges in June of 1919, has a lot to do with World War I. And what had happened was, again, American women had been talking about not having the right to vote from the very beginning. And we have Abigail Adams' famous letter to John, don't forget the ladies, which he promptly does. And American women do not have the vote for the first 100 years or more, 150 years of our republic. Now, the vote is not guaranteed, as we know, to anyone. The Constitution does not guarantee the right to vote. But what's interesting about why all this happens in 1919 and 1920 is that the world is changing. And this idea that's been slowly growing momentum, and it was not, it was not a done deal in any way, but all over the world, this idea of women and women's equality is beginning to take hold. So that we have to understand that women's suffrage is not just an American movement, it's an international movement. And in fact, America is only the 27th nation to give women the right to vote. We're way behind. And in 1920, we have lots of things, lots of historical currents and moments going on that are going to affect the decision. I think if we think about suffrage at all, women's suffrage, it's usually like this little bubble on its own that kind of bounces around for 7 decades. And it doesn't seem to have any connection with other strong historical movements or currents. And it's buffeted by all of them. It's buffeted by temperance and by economic forces and by social political forces, by the war, certainly, by the idea of dress, and everything affects it. It's almost a litmus test in how America is evolving. Corporate interests enter into it. You wouldn't think about that. Religious ideas enter into it. And so in 1920, the world is a dangerous place. We have just emerged from a terrible war of World War I. And our nation, which entered late in the war, in spring of 1917, is having to make decisions about what kind of role in the world are we going to play. What would later be called the American century is still in its infancy, and we're not quite sure what role we want to play. And World War I was a terrible experience, and there is a large movement for isolationism. Keep us out of another of those wars. And so you have Woodrow Wilson emerging from the war, which he was reluctantly engaged in. And he says, okay, I have an idea. We're going to have a world court, and we're going to have a League of Nations. And this is going to prevent a war, another horrible world war. And then there's blowback from that. And so there's a lot of resistance to that in the Senate, and it's not going to pass. And so we have America deciding its role for the next century, pretty much. And women want to be part of that. They've played an enormous role in World War I, doing jobs that women had never done before. And that's not just nursing and the usual kind of caretaking, but it's in the fields, in the land army, it's in the mines, it's in the railroads. They're taking on men's work. And so the argument that women are too fragile, too emotionally unstable and flighty, too pure to be able to handle the big decision of voting suddenly sounds hollow. So you have that coming out of World War I, and it's no coincidence that British women also get the vote right towards the end of the war. Russia after the revolution, gives women the vote. Even Germany gives women the vote before we do. So we have that. The nation in 1920 is also in the throes of labor unrest. There have been something like 2,000 labor actions in the preceding year, because after the war, there's a recession. Soldiers are returning from the front. Black soldiers are returning from service, and they expect to be able to have decent jobs. So there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of labor fighting. There's also racial unrest in many cities. 1919 is often called Red Summer because of the fires. So you have a lot of racial tension. You have a lot of anxiety about immigration. And in fact, the Congress will in the following year or two enact very restrictive immigration laws, which will haunt us for another generation. And you also have women debating, or the nation debating, birth control. You have lots of things going on, and all of those are arguments in this debate about whether American women deserve political equality, because it's not just about the vote. It's not just about a constitutional amendment. It's about a cultural change, a societal change of women's role and rights in society. So that makes it much more complicated, much more of what we would call a culture war issue.
And it's such a dynamic period. And you mentioned Carrie Catt, like the heir to Susan B. Anthony. But before I want to talk about some of the activists pushing women's suffrage, there was a whole group called the Antis actually campaigning against women's suffrage. And we have this one woman, Josephine Pearson. Can you talk a little bit more about the anti-movement and some of the other forces, specifically now here in Tennessee, arrayed against, you mentioned corporate interests like the textiles and railroads. Can you talk about what some of the suffragettes were up against here in 1920?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think this is the most surprising part of the story. I know I learned that was my reaction, and it was certainly the reaction of my readers who said, "Oh, I never knew this." And of course, we, haven't had a lot of information about it, except in scholarly work. I always want to give credit to scholarly work. What the fact that there were organized women against the idea of other women getting the right to vote was really shocking. I just sort of, what? How could that be? But then you think of it, and I realized that I had to really delve into this. I couldn't just dismiss them as wrong-headed or behind the times or anything like that, because they had some strong arguments. I don't agree with them, but they were strong, and we still hear the essence of those arguments today. So I want to go through a little bit. We talked about corporate interests. We're sort of, we understand that men might be against this because men are going to have to share power. Women are half of the electorate, and they are going to have to share power. Well, theoretically, at least at the polling place. But why would women be against this? And I realized that I had to not only read deeply and try to find as much about how they viewed this debate, but also to not belittle them, because they were worthy opponents. They really almost won, as you see in the story. And so what kind of woman was against women's suffrage? Well, there are different reasons, of course. One category was wealthy, comfortable women who had the privilege, had the comfort, had the relationships with men in power. So, one example that always shocks people is that Eleanor Roosevelt was not a suffragist. Yeah, that one really. She was not an anti-suffragist, though the anti-suffragists tried in 1920 to get her to come out as against the amendment, hoping that that would really be a celebrity get, even though she's not a celebrity at that time. But her husband, Franklin, is running on the Democratic ticket for the vice president in 1920. So she grows up in this milieu where comfortable, wealthy women in powerful families. Why do you need the vote? Uncle Teddy's in the White House. Why do I need the vote? I'll just tell him what I think. And so there were women married to bankers and to lawyers or from those families as daughters who just don't think, no reason women, and they don't want uneducated women to vote. They don't want the immigrants to vote. They don't want the shop and factory girls to vote. And many of them don't want Black women to vote. So you have that segment. Then you have those who are cultural, religious conservatives. And we certainly know women like that today who their beliefs lead them to not support this idea of women entering into the political world, even voting. Even the idea of voting, they see as will tarnish a woman's moral standing, her purity, her innocence. Politics is a dirty game, and if she even touches it by having to think about the candidates or the issues, this is going to corrupt her. um, religious opposition comes from, and including clergy, who see the idea of women demanding equality as against God's plan, or their view of God's plan. Who, they use biblical language. God created Adam to be dominant over Eve, and you're not going to mess with that. And so they really use the Bible to rail from the pulpit and from the pews against the idea of women getting the vote. So you have the religious opposition, the cultural opposition, the idea, again, that's spread through anti-suffrage propaganda, is that this is going to destroy the American family. Women are going to abandon their families if they're given the right to vote. Honest, there's really powerful broadsides and graphic material and posters that show, and some of them I have in the book, that show mothers leaving their children, leaving their family to either go campaign for women's suffrage, or, if they get it, to vote. And this idea that women are just, if they're given the green light to enter into this other political world, that's going to be dangerous. And, they even say divorces are going to be very prominent in our lives because women are going to argue with their husbands about who to vote for. Maybe that was true. But anyway, that's the idea that this is going to disrupt the family, the central tenet of life, is a very powerful and actually widespread argument against suffrage. And then you have the racial aspects. And there are some of these anti-suffragists, there are suffragists who are racist, there are also anti-suffragists who really use it as, they weaponize this idea of race. And they use it to argue that if, especially in the South, especially in Tennessee, that if the federal amendment, which gives the right to vote to all eligible women citizens, is allowed, then Black women will be included, and that is not acceptable in the South. This will undermine the whole concept of white supremacy, because maybe Black women will think they are socially equal to. So you have very complicated, interrelated messages that the anti-suffragists are using to both gather support and to convince the men, because the men are making these decisions. The men are in Congress, except for Jeanette Rankin. The men are in the legislatures in the states. They have to appeal to men. And they are using these kinds of, this is going to endanger your home, Mr. Legislator. You don't want this. So there are really powerful pressures being put on the male legislators. Josephine Pearson is one of my main characters. She is the president of the Tennessee Women Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And she's quite a character. She is actually the most educated of all of the women I write about, because she is an academic. She is a political science professor. She doesn't have a PhD, but I think she does have a master's degree. She teaches mostly in small Christian women's colleges. And she is a dean in these colleges. She's a very acerbic kind of personality. I loved reading her handwritten letters, because you just saw her anger and her vitriol and her insecurities. She had beautiful handwriting, teacher's handwriting, and she loved underlining and capitalizing and putting things in quotations. And you just saw her passion come through in her handwriting. It's one of those things I think historians are going to lose because people do so little of that handwritten material. But you really see personalities come through. even what she scratches out is very, very meaningful. So I use her as emblematic of what the anti-suffragists are trying to do. And then there's another major anti-suffrage character in the book named Charlotte Rao, who is a national spokeswoman. She comes down from New York to be the voice of the anti-suffragists. She's very skilled. She is very clever. She thinks on her feet. She has a biting tongue and a lacerating wit, and she is a force that the suffragists, they hate her, but they also kind of admire her because she's so good at what she does. But she is, she is telling the legislators and anyone else who will listen, this is dangerous, and we're going down the road of ancient Greece and Rome, and we're going to, all fall apart if women can vote. So she's a great character to follow. But it was a substantive opposition.
And then on the other side, we have Carrie Catt and Sue White. I mean, it's so many incredible women, but can you talk a little bit more about Carrie Catt and Sue White? And then also briefly summarize, for me, the last few chapters of the book was like, I was holding my breath. We all knew that the amendment got passed, but you're like, oh my goodness, is it going to happen or not?
Yeah.
Briefly summarize those few weeks in August 1920, what happened and when it finally passed.
Yeah, so in the spring and early summer, of 1920, the suffragists had finally gotten to 35 states, had ratified the amendment. They need 36, and they can't get the 36th state. It's just not happening. Even moderate states like Delaware had rejected it. Maryland, where I live, had rejected it. Almost all of the southern states, not all, but almost all. And there were a few states where the governors refused to call their legislators back to even consider it. They were under corporate pressure, and their donors did not want, and the railroads and the textile manufacturers. And I'll just say, why are these corporate entities against women's suffrage? What does that have to do with anything? Well, it does, and it shows you how a social movement is not isolated. It is part of the fabric of what's going on in a nation. So the textile manufacturers are very active in trying to squelch ratification because they fear that if women can vote, they are going to want to abolish child labor. And these textile mills depend upon child labor and cheap women's labor to keep prices down. So that's their rationale. The railroads are against suffrage because they've already bought off most of the state legislators and most of congressmen. They need favors. 1920, they're coming out of nationalization after World War I. So they need a lot of favors and favorable funding mechanisms from Congress and from the legislatures. And they've bought off these, with various cash bribes. Almost all the legislators in Tennessee have jobs with the railroad. And so they don't want to upset the apple cart. They'll have to buy off new candidates if women kind of don't go the way that they want them to go. So they're trying to keep women out of the polls. And then, of course, the liquor industry. Women were always very involved in the temperance movement. Prohibition is in effect. The 18th Amendment is already ratified the year before. But so you say, well, gosh, that train has left the station. Why are they at all interested in keeping women away at this point? Well, they're hoping if they can keep women away, that the Volstead Acts and Prohibition will not be enforced too stringently. If they can get what they call wet candidates into the legislatures and into Congress, it'll be softened. So that's why they're still involved. So they have 35 states, they need the 36. It turns out through a lot of machinations that Tennessee emerges as the only possible state that would make a decision before registration deadlines and for the fall 1920 election. And the 1920 election is going to be important because the nation's going to make these decisions about its role and its vision for the century or the next several decades at least. So American women really want to be involved in this. And also the suffragists realize the nation is swinging in a more reactionary way. They can see it coming. Progressive era is over. The nation is becoming more isolationist, more nativist. And we know the 1920s turned out to be a very conservative period politically. And so they realize, and I think very astutely, that if they don't get Tennessee, if they can't wrap up this ratification process now, before the 1920 election, which is giving some impetus and pressure to the politicians, they may not see this happen. It might not happen in their lifetimes. They're already on the third generation. They're in the 8th decade of fighting for this. And they really fear if they can't do it now, they won't see it in their own lifetimes. So, and the anti-suffragists also see this as a pivotal battle. If they can't stop it now, it's all over. So you see all the pressure come into Tennessee. And it's, I had the great pleasure of chronicling all the crazy stuff that goes on. And whether that's the liquor industry trying to influence the legislators with a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel, where everybody is staying, the suffragists, the anti-suffragists, the corporate lawyers, the journalists, they're all staying in this beautiful hotel. And they open up, you might call it a hospitality suite. And even though it's prohibitions in effect, they dispense liquor 24/7. And they try to ply these very susceptible legislators into, this is why you should vote against ratification. Have another drink, bottoms up. And so there are these scenes of these drunk legislators, bouncing off the walls, and they have to be thrown into the shower before they can go in to vote. But you see that the pressure, and then you have the presidential candidates involved or not involved enough. And you have Woodrow Wilson in the White House, who has finally come around to the idea of supporting the federal amendment. He'd been against women's suffrage all of his career. And why has he made this kind of sudden turn? Well, there's several reasons. One is that there were pickets outside the White House for the last several years. That's Alice Paul and her radical wing of the suffrage movement, the National Women's Party. But also, he wants women to vote because he needs pressure on Congress to approve the League of Nations Treaty. And he feels women like to vote for peace. Women as mothers will want a more peaceful world. And so he's counting on women being able to vote to sustain his legacy. He sees the League of Nations as his legacy. So he's voting, he's now helping the suffragists in a way he didn't before, but it's somewhat in his own self-interest too. So you see his machinations. And of course, he's been sidelined for the last almost 6 months with a stroke. He was paralyzed. His wife is in the White House. Edith is actually running the White House and making a lot of decisions for him. And she's an anti-suffragist. So it's really, really interesting. So you have all of these forces coming into Nashville. And there are fist fights, and there's conspiracy theories, and there's bribery, and there's threats and kidnapping and all kinds of nasty stuff as it comes down to these final votes. And it all ultimately comes down to the final vote in the House of Delegates, and the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, 24-year-old freshman delegate from a hill town in East Tennessee, ends up breaking a tie. And remember, so this is still really close. And he had been against the amendment. He wore a red rose, or I should mention that it's called the War of the Roses in Nashville because the anti-suffragists wear a red rose, an American Beauty rose, and the suffragists wear yellow roses. And so you could tell where people stood by what the insignia they wore. And he wore a red one, and he voted with the anti-suffragists. But that morning, he received a communication from his mother. And that's all I'll say.
Well, I mean, I would love to be greedy and just keep talking the whole time, because this was an absolutely fascinating read. But we have the questions already pouring in from the audience. So I'm going to hand it over to Corette, and she's going to ask you those audience questions. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much. We have lots of questions, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. The first question is from Anna from Oregon, and she asks, why did the Western states pass women's suffrage before the rest of the country?
Absolutely important question. And so I have to just go back and explain a little bit how the right to vote is granted. There are two ways. One is by the states. The states, according to the Constitution, are in charge of voting. They are in charge of requirements for voting and for the process of the electoral, voting day. And that's why we have so many different, to this day, so many different state laws, so many different suppression and restriction laws. So each state manages their own. So what the suffragists worked on two tracks, and one was to get individual states to change their constitutions and allow women to vote. And the other was to go the, all at once route, which was get it through Congress and then all states get it. And there were going to be, they knew that most states would never give women the vote, including New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maryland, states you wouldn't think about, but then it was clear they would never give women the vote. So you see the first states allowing women to vote are in the West. They're really territories first, like Wyoming. Wyoming gets the great first billing as first state. When it is a territory in 1869, it allows women to vote. Now, I should say that there are like 6 women in Wyoming at this time. I'm exaggerating, but they need women. And it's used on the frontier. It's really used as a marketing tool. Besides justice, it's also a marketing tool. And this idea of, building these towns together. I don't like to say, building civilization, because they are usurping a civilization that was already there. But there is a sense of working together. There are not the establishment cultural norms that are in the East, in the more settled areas. So you have all that going on. And there's that wonderful story of the territorial governor when in 1890, when Wyoming wants to become a state, they put in their application and Congress writes back, oh, well, you allow women to vote. We don't do that in the United States. And he writes back, we would stay out of the Union 100 years if we can't take our women. And so you see Colorado in 1893, actually the men vote in a referendum and they approve suffrage. So Idaho, Utah, where the Mormon women are allowed to vote. And that's a very interesting situation. And then slowly, it takes a long time, not till the 20th century, that Washington State, Oregon, and California give the right to vote. And in the Northeast, it fails. It fails completely until 1917, when New York men, in a second and third attempt, allow. So there's a lot of really interesting research in why the Western states, but I've given you a couple of ideas. One of them is that it's just a whole new world, and they need women. And the other is that it also gives them more voters in their representation in Congress. So
Okay. The next question is from Alf from Tucson, Arizona. And he asks, do you think the 19th Amendment would have passed when it did if the US hadn't been directly involved in World War I?
Well, that's very interesting. I think World War I did really have a strong influence. And again, it's because women, American women, entered the war effort in ways that they'd never been allowed to before. You know, some of them are literally flying planes. And I think that really did change attitudes about what women could and couldn't do, or should and shouldn't do. So I think, in fact, if we had remained as bystanders, which we did for the first 3.5 years of the war, I think it would have been different. That the American men would not have seen women in this new role that did influence their thinking. So I think that it's true that it might not have passed.
The next question is from Michael, saying hello from Los Angeles, California. He said, the following sentences really resonated for me with the current BLM and defund the police movements. There's always a tricky trade-off between the benefits of gaining attention from dramatic action and the risk of alienating the public and jeopardizing support. One thing seems certain, such painful rifts within protest movements appear to be essential components of the ecosystem of change. Your thoughts in regards to these two movements?
Oh, yes. And I have to say that I wrote those words several years ago, and it, certainly true for the suffrage movement. So just to explain, as it did in Great Britain, the suffrage movement splits in the first and second decades of the 20th century between those who want to take a more radical approach, a more confrontational approach. It's militant in the UK because they actually destroy property, they throw bombs, they shatter Selfridges windows. In America, there's no property damage like that, but they are picketing, which had never been done in front of the White House. They are demonstrating. They are going to prison and being arrested. And I have to say, when I saw the Black Lives Matter protesters in Lafayette Park, and then they are, attacked by police and arrested, all I could think of was, oh my God, it's Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. And what we have to understand, it was very controversial within the suffrage movement because this was wartime. They began picketing the White House in 1917, and they had watch fires of freedom, which were bonfires on the sidewalk, where they would burn President Wilson's words when he talked about making the world safe for democracy. And they said, how can you talk about democracy in World War I when we don't have democracy here? So they were calling him a hypocrite. And this idea of confrontation, of embarrassing the powers that be, of actually campaigning against him in 1916, Carrie Catt looks at this and says, this is terrible. No, this is going to alienate our friends. You're working against Democrats, even if they support suffrage. And so, the other thing I remember thinking so clearly in 2018, when the young, insurgent young women elected to Congress and challenging the leadership, Nancy Pelosi. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's Carrie Catt and Alice Paul all over again. And yes, I think that we see this happen in almost every long-term reform movement. And it happened in the labor movement. You have the Wobblies coming up and doing things that are much more aggressive and violent, and there's backlash. It will happen later in the civil rights movement. You have Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, very different visions of how to progress. It'll happen in the gay rights movement with ACT UP. It'll happen with the animal rights movement with PETA. So you see this. That's why I say it's not just a suffrage movement, but it is something that almost every movement has to reckon with. And I think most historians agree now that it took both. It took that good cop, bad cop, aggressive, more ladylike approach, and it was the synergy of both of them that got it across.
Interesting, very interesting. The next question is from James from Wichita Falls, and he asks, he says, thanks to our adult daughter, I show the movie Iron Jaw Angels each school year to complement the teaching of the women's suffrage movement to his US history classes. He says that movie focused on the Tennessee vote late in the movie. Do you agree or disagree that this movie is an excellent teaching tool?
Well, it's been a while since I've seen it. I purposely didn't watch it while I was writing the book. Of course, it's told from the point of view of Alice Paul, who had been totally forgotten in the movement for a long time. And so she becomes this very kind of romantic hero of sacrifice and vision. And she was in many ways. But I frankly don't think that her approach would have succeeded if it was on its own. It needed the balance of Carrie Cat. And so I deal a lot with their relationship, or lack of thereof, their rivalry. I would suggest that in the future, you now have some wonderful new teaching tools. And the one that comes to mind immediately is the terrific PBS documentary that is actually airing nationally again this week. But you can see it online, and there's a whole educational component to it. It's called The Vote. It's 4 hours, but there are segments of it, and I think there may be a shorter version. But it's the best introduction, but it's more than introduction. It deals with all of the elements, all of the themes. It's eye-popping in its visual interpretation. I mean, there are newsreels that I've never seen, and it's just a beautiful piece of work. I join many scholars and more people much more eminent than I am as being, the talking heads. But when I saw the finished piece, I was just blown away. And I think that is really even a better teaching tool. But Iron Jawed Angels is a great introduction.
Yes, I've seen that documentary now like 3 times.
Isn't it amazing?
Amazing. It's really wonderful. The next question is from Brady, and he asks, to what extent does your book grapple with white supremacy racism that often split the solidarity among women from different backgrounds during the movement for women's suffrage?
I'd say it's one of the main themes of the book. I didn't expect it to be when I first delved into it, but it was clear very quickly that race was going to be, if not the essential theme of the book, one or two. And the racism within the movement, but also we have to look at it in a nuanced way. One of the things that's disturbed me in the centennial year, when there's been a lot of media attention, finally, on the movement, is that there's been these statements, and I see this in very reputable publications all the time, saying the 19th Amendment did not give Black women the right to vote. And that is not correct. So please do not use any materials that say that. The 19th Amendment did give Black women the right to vote. All women citizens in every state, in every election. It did not give the vote to Native American women who lived on reservations. They were not considered citizens in 1920. It did not give the vote to Asian American women because they were not considered. It would take decades more for them to win the right to vote. For African American women, in the South, the 19th Amendment would be subverted by Jim Crow laws, the same laws that subverted the 15th Amendment for Black men. And so they would just institute Jim Crow restrictions and violence and intimidation the same way they did to the 15th Amendment. But it's not the 19th Amendment that is the cause of this. So that's one of the things I really try to bring home, that we have to understand who's at fault that the 19th Amendment did not provide the vote for Black women in the South. In the North and in the West, it does. Ida B. Wells is voting in Chicago. The only reason, Mary Church Terrell, one of the great African-American suffrage leaders, is not voting is because she lives in Washington, D.C., but that's because Washington, D.C. Residents do not have the vote. So we need to understand that and explain. There are nuances. There's also so I deal a lot with how race enters into the movement from the beginning, from the time Frederick Douglass sits in the chapel in Seneca Falls and supports Elizabeth Cady Stanton's call for the vote. And I do believe that if it was not for Frederick Douglass convincing the other very reluctant participants who wanted her to take it off the agenda, if it wasn't for him, we would never hear about Seneca Falls. So I do deal with that a lot. It's very important, but it's also important to realize the nuances. Someone like Carrie Catt, who is sometimes called a racist, I try to explain, and again, she does make racist decisions. And those are horrible political compromises. But political compromise is sometimes necessary. At the very end in Congress, on the last gasp, the last vote before the Senate finally puts it through, there's an amendment, I guess a clause introduced to say, okay, we'll pass this 19th Amendment, but it'll only be for white women. They have to fight that back. On the other hand, they do, the world is segregated and Black women are not involved in the white women's, in some places they are, it depends where you live. So it's nuanced. It's not so cut and dry. But it's still an important story to see how race did shape this movement and shape the aftermath.
Yes, absolutely. So now we only have time for one more question. So this is the final one. And this question is from Carrie from San Antonio, Texas. And her question, she says, is why so many of us didn't know this story? Why didn't it become part of our national story? How is it that so many of us grew up maybe having heard the name Susan Anthony, but absolutely never having heard of people like Matilda Jocelyn Gage or Alice Paul or Ida B. Wells or even Elizabeth Cady Stanton? Is it as simple as who has been writing, telling the stories?
Yeah, well, believe me, I have thought of that many, many, many times. And I don't have a real answer. I mean, the kind of glib answer is, well, it was women's history. And we know, just as African-American history was not told for very, very long. And yes, it was who was writing, but women have been writing history too. Now, again, there are generations of wonderful scholarship on this. But why it's not taught more completely and more widely, it's interesting because I've been talking to people, I was traveling around the country, now I'm zooming around the country. And some people have told me that women who are serving on the state school board or the state advisory councils of school board, that teaching suffrage is now, in some places, considered partisan and political and should not be part of the curriculum, which drives me crazy. But this is women's history. And it's race history. And it's our ambivalence about democracy history. So why? I think my first answer would be because it was about women and it just wasn't considered that important. And yes, it was who was writing the history, though again, I think women have been writing history for a while. I mean, one of the great, still seminal books is Century of Struggle by Eleanor Flexner. I mean, I have it on my bookshelf. I used it extensively. It's still a great, great compilation resource. And there have been wonderful new books that have come out since in this centennial year. Just a great explosion of wonderful new versions of the story. And I really, suggest everyone take a look, including the new book that came out this week by Professor Martha Jones called Vanguard, which is about how African-American women fought for the vote. I'm reading it right now and it's great. So I think we have a great opportunity, and the centennial gives us that opportunity. It's also one of the reasons I wanted so much to have a young readers version of the book, which came out this summer for kind of middle grade students, but I hear some adults are reading it too. It's a slimmed down version, simplified version, but again, giving this idea of activism. That's what I want to get across, that ordinary citizens, often starting very young. I tell the story of Elizabeth Stanton starting, being a young child who realizes that there are discriminatory laws in her father's law books, and she wants to cut them out with a scissor. And Carrie Catt, who's 13 years old when she realizes her mother can't vote. So I wanted young people to realize that their activism can bear fruit, and it's worth working for a cause.
Well, Elaine Weiss, thank you so much for this incredible, incredible conversation. Thank you, Corette, for corralling all those questions. Before I let everyone go, I'm just going to share my screen one more time. And the young adult reader version was mentioned, so we wanted to show that beautiful cover as well. So that version of the Woman's Hour is available as well. And we just want to echo everything you said, Ms. Weiss. We actually had Martha Jones on the program here about her book Vanguard just a few weeks ago.
Oh, great. That's great.
Now, for you teachers out there, I mentioned it at the beginning of the program. We have a master's degree in partnership with Pace University in American History. All sorts of many of the course leaders, the professors, have actually also been featured here on Book Breaks. If you want to learn more about this fantastic course, just head over to gilderlerman.org. And here are some of the fantastic courses available. The American Enlightenment with Caroline Winter, featured on Book Breaks. We've had The Fight for Women's Rights with Catherine Clinton, featured on Book Breaks. The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. with Peniel Joseph, featured here on Book Breaks. And we also want to tell everyone about this exciting new project that's happening at the Gilder Lehrman Collection. There is a new transcription project, and Elaine Weiss mentioned about making sure we can read handwriting, and we need people's help to sign up. And we will be sending the link for where you can find out more and help sign up and help the Gilder Lehrman Collection with this project in the follow-up email that will be sent tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. We also want to mention, everyone, that Gilder Lehrman Institute has a gift shop available. You just go to gligiftshop.com, and we will make the link for that available in the follow-up email as well. And you can get all sorts of fantastic swag, posters, tote bags, mugs, all sorts of other fantastic things available there. Now, if you're interested in purchasing the Woman's Hour, I highly recommend you do, just from listening to this fantastic conversation. And I can just say it is a fantastic read and an important piece of our history. Head over to the Gilder Lehrman page of bookshop.org. And if you purchase the book through bookshop.org, not only does this help support the work of the Gilder Lehrman Institute, it also helps support independent bookstores, which really could use our support at this time. And we want to talk about some of the other fantastic programs available. This coming Thursday, September 17th at 7 p.m., we have our program with the collection Inside the Vault. And we're going to be celebrating Constitution Day, featuring drafts of the U.S. Constitution, which did give women the right to vote at that time, and other related materials from the Constitutional Convention. And I hope everyone can join us next Sunday, September 20th, here on Book Breaks. when we'll be joined by Richard Brookhiser and his book, Give Me Liberty. And if you're interested in finding out any more about all these fantastic programs or how you can help out and get more resources on American history, just head over to gilderlerman.org. And as I mentioned before, the links for all the links that Corette shared and all the links for all these other things will be shared in the follow-up email. So Elaine Weiss, again, a huge thank you for joining us here on a Sunday afternoon in this fantastic conversation and writing this incredible book. Corette, a big thank you to you for collecting all those fantastic questions. And you, our audience, a big thank you to you for always joining us here on Sunday. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.